During a quiet fundraising dinner at one of Toronto's most prestigious hotels, a wealthy widower was about to sign away far more than his charitable donation. While his companion stepped away from the table, a small boy in worn-out sneakers slipped through the kitchen entrance and reached him just in time to whisper, "Sir," she told the man in the kitchen, "to put something in your drink." On instinct, without a word to anyone, he switched his glass with hers. 2 hours later, everything changed. The evening had begun the way most of Walter Ainsworth's evenings began these days, with obligation dressed up as pleasure. The Harrington Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed for the Lakeside Children's Foundation Gala, its high ceilings strung with warm gold lights, round tables draped in ivory linen, the kind of event where the wine cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. Walter had attended 100 of these things over the years, first with Margaret beside him, then alone, and the loneliness of the second variety had never quite dulled into comfort. At 61, Walter Ainsworth was what people in Toronto's financial circles called a self-made man, though he privately found the phrase insufferable. His grandfather had been a plumber in Hamilton. His father had run a small print shop. Walter had built Ainsworth Capital into one of the most respected private equity firms in the country through 20 years of 18-hour days, 2 failed business ventures, and the kind of stubbornness that his late wife had called either his greatest quality or his worst one, depending on the afternoon. Margaret had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He had sold the big house in Rosedale afterward, moved into a high-rise condominium on the waterfront, and thrown himself into work with the particular ferocity of a man who understood, somewhere deep and unspoken, that stopping meant having to feel things he was not ready to feel. He was watching the ice melt in his scotch when Claudine Beaumont appeared at his table. She was 46, French-Canadian, a management consultant who had been introduced to him at a similar event 8 months ago by a mutual acquaintance whose name Walter could no longer remember. She was beautiful in a precise, careful way, dark hair, excellent posture, a laugh that arrived exactly on cue. She had pursued him with a patience and subtlety that Walter, who prided himself on reading people, had entirely mistaken for genuine affection. "You look like you're solving a merger in your head," she said, sliding into the seat beside him. "Just thinking," he replied, and reached for his drink before setting it down again without explanation. Some instinct he couldn't name, making him pause. The instinct had been building all evening. Small things. The way Claudine had excused herself twice already, longer than necessary. The way she kept checking her phone under the table, angling the screen away from him. The way she'd insisted on selecting the table, this particular table, close to the kitchen entrance. He'd filed each detail away in the habit of a man who had spent 4 decades trusting his gut over his spreadsheets. When the soup arrived, she excused herself a 3rd time. "Back in a moment," she said, touching his arm. "Don't let them take my bread." Walter watched her go. The ballroom hummed around him. A string quartet was playing something he didn't recognize near the far wall. He reached for his glass again, and that was when he noticed the boy. He appeared at the edge of the table the way children sometimes do, in crowds, suddenly as though he'd materialized from the noise and the movement rather than walked through it. He was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, small for his age, wearing a gray hoodie with a broken zipper and jeans that were clean but thin at the knees. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His eyes were a startling pale green, and they were fixed on Walter's glass with an expression that was not childlike at all. "Sir," the boy said very quietly, "don't drink that." Walter stared at him. "I beg your pardon, the lady?" The boy's voice was barely above a whisper, and he kept glancing toward the kitchen entrance. "She went in through the back. I was near the loading dock. I stay there sometimes when it's cold. She gave money to a man in a white uniform. I heard her say your name. She said to put something in the drink, the one that's marked. And she showed him which glass. He swallowed. I don't know what it was, but she paid him a lot. I saw the bills." For a moment, Walter didn't move. His mind, the same mind that had closed 34 acquisitions, that had sat across from hostile boards and government regulators and not blinked, ran very quickly through the mathematics of the situation, the boy's face, his posture. The way his hands were pressed flat against his thighs, steadying himself. There was no artifice there. Children were not, in Walter's experience, especially good at performing fear. He looked at his glass, looked at Claudine's, identical beside it, looked at the kitchen entrance. Then, with the unhurried movement of a man reaching for the bread basket, he switched the glasses. "What's your name?" he said softly, but a security guard had appeared at the boy's shoulder, a large man in a black suit with the expression of someone who had already decided the situation. "Sorry, sir. This kid got in through the service area. We'll get him out of your way." "Wait," Walter began. The boy was already being steered away, but he turned his head once, briefly, and met Walter's eyes. Something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, or the particular recognition of two people who understood each other faster than the words between them warranted. Then he was gone. Walter set both hands on the table and breathed once, slowly. Claudine returned 3 minutes later. She was composed. Her lipstick was fresh. She sat down and reached for her glass without hesitation and lifted it toward him in a small toast. "To a lovely evening." Walter raised his glass. He did not drink. What followed was 25 minutes that he would later describe to the police detective as the most peculiar of his life. He ordered coffee. He moved his drink around. He asked Claudine questions about her upcoming contract in Vancouver and listened to her answers and watched, with the detached attention of someone observing a situation from outside it, as the color in her cheeks shifted as she pressed 2 fingers to her temple and called it a headache, as her words began arriving with a half-second delay they hadn't had before. "You don't look well," he said at last. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I just need some air, I think. Could we?" Her phone buzzed on the table. She reached for it and he saw her face change, confusion first, then something sharper and more frightened. He had glimpsed the screen for only a moment. 2 words. "Why isn't it working?" Walter set down his coffee cup. "Claudine," he said, and his voice was very even. "I think we need to call an ambulance." "No, Walter, I'm perfectly fine." "For you," he said gently. "Not for me." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Long enough for Claudine to understand what he had said, long enough for her to understand what it meant. By the time paramedics arrived, Claudine's hands were trembling visibly, and her speech had blurred at the edges. Walter stood in the corridor outside the ballroom and gave a hotel manager his contact information and called his head of security, who had been with him for 11 years and answered on the first ring without being asked what had happened, simply because Walter's voice, when it had that particular quality, meant something was wrong. "I need everything you can find on Claudine Beaumont," Walter said. "Tonight." "It's already running," said the voice on the other end. Then Walter did something he had not done in 4 years. He went to find a child he didn't know because it suddenly seemed like the most important thing in the world. The security guard who had removed the boy was still near the service entrance, filling out an incident report on a tablet. Walter walked up to him directly. "The boy you removed earlier," he said. "Where did he go?" The guard shifted. "Sir, we escorted him off the property. He was trespassing. Did you call anyone? Child services? The police?" A pause. "He ran before we could." Walter walked out through the service entrance into the cold November air of the loading dock. The dock backed onto an alley lit by a single street lamp, flanked on both sides by the geometry of downtown service lanes, dumpsters, the backs of restaurants and hotels. He stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The boy was sitting on an upturned milk crate near the far dumpster, eating what appeared to be a dinner roll he had taken from somewhere inside. He looked up when Walter appeared, and he did not run. He watched with those pale green eyes as Walter crossed the alley and stopped a few feet away. "You waited," Walter said. "I wanted to know if you were okay," the boy said around the dinner roll. Then, as if realizing that sounded more vulnerable than he intended, he added, "And I left my backpack." Walter looked and saw a small backpack tucked between the dumpster and the wall, a green canvas thing, duct-taped along one strap, with a school library sticker on the front that read Toronto Public Library. Proud reader. He crouched down so they were at eye level. "I switched the glasses," he said. "Like you told me." The boy let out a long breath. "Good. Can you tell me what you heard?" "Exactly?" The boy, whose name Walter would learn was Kit, told him. His voice was careful and specific in the way that children's voices become when they have spent time being believed or not believed by adults and have learned that precision matters. He described the woman and the man in the kitchen, the envelope of cash, the exact words, the drink that's marked for the man at table 7, the one by the pillar, the phrase that had made Kit's stomach drop and sent him scrambling for a way inside. It'll look like his heart just gave out. Walter listened to all of it without interruption. Then he said, "Why did you warn me? You didn't know me." Kit looked at the dinner roll. "You looked like my grandfather," he said, after a moment. "He died 2 years ago. He stopped then quietly. "I didn't want someone else's grandfather to die because nobody said anything." Something happened in Walter's chest. It was quiet, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. "What's your name?" Walter asked. "Kit. Kit what?" A pause. "Just Kit for now." Walter nodded. He did not push. "Are you hungry, Kit?" The boy looked at the dinner roll. "I have this. That's not what I asked." A long silence, and then, "Yeah, I'm hungry." There was a diner 2 blocks from the hotel, the kind with booths upholstered in red vinyl and laminated menus, and a cook who clearly viewed his work as a personal calling rather than a job. Walter and Kit sat across from each other, and Kit ate scrambled eggs and bacon and toast, and then, when Walter suggested it, a slice of pie, all without lifting his eyes from the plate, except to answer questions, which he did in the short, measured sentences of someone who had learned that offering too much information at once was usually a mistake. He was 11 years old. He had been living on and off the streets since September, which was 2 months ago, when the woman who had been his foster carer had lost her apartment and the placement had dissolved. Before that, he had been in care for 3 years. Since his mother's death, he did not know his father. He had no siblings. He had, until recently, been attending school, which he said in a way that made it clear he missed it more than he was willing to admit. Walter listened to all of this with the stillness of a man who had learned that stillness, in the right circumstances, was a form of respect. "You're not going to call social services tonight, are you?" Kit said. It was not entirely a question. "Not tonight," Walter said. "Tonight I'm going to make sure you're somewhere warm and safe." He paused. "And I'd like your help with something if you're willing." Kit's eyes narrowed. "What kind of help?" "The police are going to need to hear what you heard," Walter said, "and I need someone who will tell them exactly what you told me. They'll put me back in the system." "Maybe," Walter said honestly, "but not tonight, and I won't let it happen without making sure someone is paying attention to what happens to you." Kit considered him for a long time. He was a child who had learned to read adults the way some people learn to read weather, watching for the small signals that indicated what was actually coming, regardless of what was being said. He studied Walter's face. "You switched the glasses," Kit said finally. "You actually listened to me." "Yes. Most adults don't." "I know," Walter said. "I'm sorry about that." Another silence. Then Kit picked up his fork and finished the pie, and Walter understood that this was the only form of agreement he was going to get tonight, and that it was enough. The detective who arrived at the hotel 40 minutes later was named Rosario Chen, a compact woman in her early 50s with short gray-streaked hair and eyes that moved through a room the way a camera does, cataloging without lingering. She had been with the Toronto Police's Financial Crimes Unit for 16 years, and she registered Kit's presence without visible surprise, which Walter took as a mark in her favor. Kit gave his statement sitting beside a hotel manager's assistant, who had been called in as an informal support person, speaking in the same precise, careful way he'd used with Walter. He described the woman, the kitchen worker, the envelope, the words. When Rosario asked follow-up questions, he answered them. When she asked if he was sure, he said yes, without qualification. "He's a reliable witness," Rosario told Walter afterward in the corridor. "Better than most adults, frankly. His recall is specific." "What happens now?" Walter asked. "We're running the kitchen worker. The compound in Ms. Beaumont's blood work." She paused. "We'll know more tomorrow. But initial indicators suggest this was not amateur. She was working with someone, almost certainly." Rosario looked at him steadily. "Mr. Ainsworth, is there anyone in your financial or personal life who might have an interest in—" "Yes," Walter said quietly. "I've been thinking about that since the alley. There was a name. There was always a name. In Walter's experience, if you were willing to follow the money back far enough." He said it, and watched Rosario write it down, and then he went back to the manager's office, where Kit was sitting with a ginger ale and a plate of hotel cookies, reading a tourism brochure about Niagara Falls, with the focused attention of someone who had run out of other things to do. Walter sat down across from him. "The detective says you're a good witness," he said. Kit shrugged, but his ears went slightly pink. "I just said what I heard. That's exactly what a good witness does." Walter folded his hands on the table. "Kit, I'd like to offer you something, and I want you to take your time thinking about it before you answer." Kit set down the Niagara Falls brochure. His posture changed, the wariness returning. That particular brace of a child who has been offered things before that turned out to mean something other than what they sounded like. "My home has a guest room," Walter said. "It's not a mansion. It's a condo on the waterfront, but it has a bed and a door that locks from the inside, and a kitchen. And I would like you to stay there while the investigation proceeds and while we figure out what the right next steps are for you." He paused. "Legally, we'll need to involve child services eventually. I won't pretend otherwise. But I'll be there, and I'll be paying attention." Kit looked at the ginger ale can, then at Walter, then at the ginger ale again. "Why?" he said. "You don't know me," Walter agreed. "But you ran through a hotel kitchen in the dark to warn a stranger, and I'd like to know a person like that a little better." The silence stretched. Outside the manager's window, the sounds of the hotel continued. Distant music from the ballroom, the murmur of staff in the corridors, the particular low hum of a building full of people. "3 days, Kit said finally. "I'll stay 3 days." Walter nodded. 3 days. He was still there at the end of a month. The weeks that followed were an exercise in disorientation for both of them, though in different directions. For Kit, the disorientation was architectural. The way the condominium's floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a view of Lake Ontario that seemed impossible, real and vast and quietly stunning, especially in the early mornings when the light was low. The way the kitchen always had food in it. The way Walter kept his word about small things in the accumulated way that eventually began to feel, cautiously, like a pattern. For Walter, the disorientation was relational. He had lived alone for 4 years. He had organized his solitude into something functional, even comfortable, and Kit's presence broke through the organization in ways that were sometimes inconvenient and persistently illuminating. The boy left library books on every flat surface. He asked questions that were disconcertingly precise. He had nightmares sometimes. Walter heard him once, from the hallway, and stood for a moment outside the closed door uncertain of the right thing to do, and then knocked softly and sat outside the door on the floor until Kit's breathing steadied. Not speaking, just present. It was a small thing. Kit never mentioned it. But 2 days later, he asked Walter if they could get a chess set. They played, slowly, over many evenings. Kit was a fast learner, the kind of learner who thought about what he was doing instead of simply reacting, and Walter found himself enjoying the games more than he'd expected. "You look at the whole board," Walter said, after Kit made a move that surprised him. "My grandfather taught me," Kit said. "He said the mistake people make is they only look at the piece they want to move, but everything on the board matters." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then, "He was a smart man. He was the best person I ever knew," Kit said simply. The police investigation moved with the steady, unglamorous pace of serious work. Claudine Beaumont had recovered in hospital and faced with the audio from Walter's security team, who had been monitoring his phone communications for the past 6 months as standard practice, and a kitchen worker who had decided cooperation was preferable to loyalty, had provided names and operational details that reached further than Walter had anticipated. The name he'd given Detective Chen on the night of the gala was correct. It was a business partner, a man he had trusted for 7 years, who had stood up at Walter and Margaret's anniversary dinner 12 years ago and given a toast about friendship and integrity. Walter sat with that for a while. He sat with it mostly on the terrace in the evenings, which is where Kit found him one night in December, 3 weeks in, when the lake had gone dark and the city lights were throwing gold across the water. "Are you sad about her?" Kit asked. He was wearing the oversized hockey sweatshirt that had appeared one day, as if by coincidence when Walter's assistant had been tasked with getting a few practical things for a guest who was staying temporarily. "No," Walter said honestly. "I'm sad about the 7 years, about being wrong about someone that long." Kit sat in the other chair. He tucked his feet up under himself the way children do without thinking about it, taking comfort from their own physical warmth. "My mom used to say that trusting the wrong person doesn't make you stupid. It makes you someone who tried." Walter looked at him. "She sounds like she was wise." She was. Kit stared at the lake. She would have liked it here. She always wanted to live near water. They sat in the dark for a while, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. Child services had been involved since the second week, necessarily, a process Walter had engaged with through the particular combination of resources, legal counsel, and patient persistence that had characterized his professional life for 4 decades. A caseworker named Anne-Marie had visited 3 times. She was a thorough woman who asked Kit careful questions and observed the apartment and spoke to Walter with a directness he appreciated. Her reports, he was told by his lawyer, were positive. At the 6th week review, seated in a conference room at the Ministry of Children and Family Services, with Kit beside him and his lawyer across the table, Walter said something that had been forming in him for weeks, the way decisions form in people who take their time with them. "I'd like to begin the formal process," he said, "for adoption." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that changes the weight of everything in them. Kit looked at him. His face did the thing it sometimes did when something surprised him, going very still, as if he were deciding whether to believe what he was seeing before he allowed himself to react to it. "That is a significant decision," Anne-Marie said carefully. "I know what it is," Walter said. "I've done nothing else but think about it for 6 weeks. He glanced at Kit. "I should have talked to you first. I'm sorry, I wanted to say it out loud before I lost my nerve." "I didn't know you had nerves," Kit said. "I keep them very hidden." He turned fully to face the boy. "This is your decision as much as mine, more than mine, actually. I don't need you to answer right now, I just needed you to know." Kit looked down at the table, then up at the window, then back at Walter with those pale green eyes that had in 6 weeks shifted from guarded to something more complicated and more hopeful. "My grandfather used to say," Kit said slowly, "that a house is just a building, but home is wherever somebody's waiting for you." Walter was quiet. "Nobody's been waiting for me in a long time," Kit said. "Not until you went out to that alley." The adoption process took 5 months. Slower than hope, faster than Walter had been prepared to believe was possible. There were interviews and home studies and documentation, and a court date in May, when a judge in a room that smelled of old wood and coffee approved what had already, in any meaningful sense, been true for quite some time. Afterward, on the steps of the courthouse on University Avenue, with the spring sun doing its best against a sky that was still more gray than blue in the way of Toronto in early May, Kit stood beside him and looked out at the street. "Ainsworth," he said, trying the name. "Kit Ainsworth. Only if you want it," Walter said. The same thing he'd said 3 times before, each time meaning it. "I want it," Kit said, without hesitation. Then, "It sounds like a character in a book." "Every good name does," Walter said. They walked down the steps together, and the detective who had been waiting on the pavement, Rosario Chen, who had driven over on her lunch hour without being asked, shook Kit's hand with the gravity of someone who understood what the moment deserved. "You were a good witness," she said to Kit. "You were a good detective," he said back, and she laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that is also a little like crying, the way the best ones sometimes are. Walter's firm held a small internal gathering. That evening, the kind his team would have called a reception, and which was, in practice, just the 15 people he'd worked with longest and trusted most, eating catered food in the boardroom and pretending the occasion wasn't as sentimental as it was. Kit moved through the room with the watchful ease of a child who had spent years observing how people behave when they think no one is looking, and Walter watched him from across the room and thought, he sees everything, he always has. Summer came, and with it school enrollment and tutors and the particular adventure of a child who loves learning encountering a library with no limit on what could be borrowed. Kit read in the mornings on the terrace, wrapped in the oversized hockey sweatshirt even when it was warm, because he'd decided it was his and Walter had decided the same. He played chess on Tuesday evenings. He had started, cautiously, a friendship with the daughter of a colleague of Walter's, a girl named, but that is a different story. One Saturday morning in July, they were eating breakfast at a place Kit had found on a street near Kensington Market, a small Greek diner with excellent eggs and coffee, strong enough to qualify as a structural material. They had been coming here most weekends for 2 months. The owner knew their order. Kit was eating and looking out the window at the market beginning to wake up, the vendors laying out their produce, a man unfolding a table of paperback books, a woman arranging flowers. Then he went still. "Dad," he said quietly. Walter looked up from his newspaper. The words still arrived in him differently than he was prepared for, every time, a small recalibration of something fundamental. "What is it?" Kit nodded, barely perceptibly, toward the door. A girl was standing just inside the entrance, 12, maybe 13, in a coat too thin for July in the way that means the coat is not about the weather. She was looking at the menu board with the focused expression of someone calculating how much the cheapest thing cost against how much they had. Walter understood immediately. "What do you think?" he said softly. "She's been there for 5 minutes," Kit said. "She's counting." Walter caught the eye of the owner, a man named Petros who had the rare quality of understanding things without being told them directly. A small nod passed between them. Kit got up from the table. He crossed the diner and stopped beside the girl without crowding her, hands in his sweatshirt pockets, looking at the menu board alongside her. "The eggs are really good," he said conversationally. "The toast too, and Petros gives you extra if you sit at the counter. He likes company in the mornings." The girl looked at him sideways, wary. "I don't really have," she began. "It's already paid for," Kit said easily. "We ordered too much. Happens every time." He nodded toward the counter. "Counter seat's better anyway. You can see the whole room." A pause. The girl looked at the counter, then at Kit, then at Walter, across the diner, who had gone back to his newspaper with the deliberate inattention of someone creating space for something to happen without the weight of adult observation. She sat at the counter. Kit came back to the table. He picked up his fork and continued his eggs. Outside, the market was fully awake now. The morning light, the particular gold of summer in the city, warm and unhurried. "You handled that well," Walter said from behind his paper. "Someone taught me," Kit said. Walter folded the paper down and looked at his son across the table, in the diner on the street in the city that was both of theirs now, and thought about all the things that begin with one person deciding to tell the truth to a stranger in the dark. "Someone very smart told me once," Walter said, "that the mistake people make is they only look at the piece they want to move, but everything on the board matters." Kit smiled. The real one. The one that still arrived less often than Walter hoped for, and more often than Kit had probably intended. "He was a wise man," Kit said. "Your teacher?" "The best I ever had," Walter agreed, and the morning continued around them, ordinary and irreplaceable, the way the best mornings always are.